welcome everyone. On behalf of our co-conveners of the Race and Leadership Research Interest Group, Viv, Yinka and Stephen, we welcome colleagues internationally from academic institutions, practitioners who are here to hear the words of Professor Gus John. We are beyond excited, thrilled and honoured to have you here, Professor John, as a legend in the field, to guide us as a luminary moving through really difficult times. So we thank you so much for being here. I'd especially like to thank and welcome, I'm hoping is coming shortly, our chair, Deborah Outhwaite, and I'd really like to extend our thanks to Cynthia from the BELMAS office, who has really supported and helped us today. So I'm hoping that Deb will come in shortly, but if she doesn't, I will move straight to hear Professor John speak. So we, as co-conveners, have taken over leadership of the research interest group from our co-conveners, former co-conveners, Professor Paul Miller, himself a legend in the field, and Professor Christine Callender, probably amongst the most influential in educational leadership in England, if not in Europe and across the world. We feel an enormous debt of gratitude in filling those shoes, and we intend to use it. So we will end this after Professor John has spoken about the global imperatives for race and leadership in education, which Viv Grant, my colleague, is going to introduce. My colleague Yinka and co-convener Yinka is going to take some questions, so do store them up ready. And then Stephen Francis, our final co-convener, is going to talk about our future plans and how you can become involved. So I just want to pause there. Cynthia, I have a couple of people texting me just asking for a link. I have a message in the chat. Okay. So what I would like to do, I think what I will do is, as I'm not seeing Deb appear, Viv, is I'm going to hand over to you and we're going to introduce Professor John, and I'm just going to pause my screen and then I'm going to just make sure that people have got the link who need it. Okay?
Right, okay. Thanks, Claire. Well, it feels a real privilege for me. I feel like I'm a youngster, really, compared to yourself, Gus, but a real privilege to introduce Gus here this afternoon, much of which Claire has already said. Many of us here, we know him as a distinguished scholar, activist and educator, I know, whose lifelong work has really profoundly shaped the way that I look at race, education and social justice. And we know that your research, Gus, and you continue to push us as academics, practitioners and institutions to confront those structures that perpetuate inequity and to build schools that truly serve all of our children. So I'm just delighted that we have this time with you this afternoon. So just yet, welcome, and the floor is yours, Gus.
Well, Viv, thank you very much, and thank you, Claire. It's wonderful to be with you again. Some of you would have been at the inaugural launch of the conference, which took place at UCL in 2019. And I was privileged to be asked to give the inaugural address, which many people keep reminding me of, for good reasons and not so good reasons. So it's good to be here again. I mean, we meet at a very difficult time globally, as Claire was indicating earlier. And I think that makes the work that you do as a research group even more critical, particularly given what's going on in Britain just now. So I've got a number of slides. I'll canter through them very quickly so that we can have an exchange afterwards. So let's have the first one, please. Is somebody operating them on my behalf? Yes?
Cynthia, are you able to share them? If not, I'll do that now, Professor John.
Okay, I'll aim to share them now. Apologies, I'll just try and get this sorted shortly.
Okay. So while we wait for the slides to come up, let me just say this. A number of you would know who I am and what I've been doing these last years. I think it's quite, okay. Let's go to the first one.
Apologies, Professor John. I'm just searching to support Cynthia. Okay, can everybody see that?
All right.
Yeah, you got it, Claire.
Fantastic.
So let's move on to the, yes, good. So we're going to be addressing this. And I think it is correct that the emphasis should be on global imperatives for reasons that I'm going to explore further in the coming slides. Next one. It seems to me that whether it be for us as Caribbean people, former enslaved, descendants of former enslaved Africans, or whether it be for white English people or anybody in Europe, given the history of these nations and the intersecting history of the global North and the global South, there is a need for schooling and education to attend to the business of self-repair and restoration. So when I was asked to do this talk, and I was asked by colleagues what it is that was the kernel of what I'm going to say, it is this next one. Deconstructing racial hierarchies globally. Okay, so I say it's imperatives for nation states and not just leaders in education, because I think anybody who's been observing what's been going on in the United States in the last year or so, and what's been happening here in Britain similarly, would agree that leadership at national level is critical, and in many ways it points to and sets an example for what leaders in education and other areas of public life should themselves be about and should see as their responsibility. Next. So we're meeting at a time when all of these things are really anniversaries of one sort or another. Becky Francis will be reporting on her curriculum and assessment review roundabout now, and I'll have much more to say about that in a minute. The Berlin Conference, 1884-85, where 14 European countries met and determined, without one African person in sight, how they would carve up the continent and who would take what and what territory they would demarcate for themselves and so on. That happened and has its impact, its consequences are still with us today. In 1900, the very first Pan-African Congress was held in London, organized by a group of African people, including Henry Sylvester Williams, a barrister from Trinidad and Tobago, who was studying here in London and working with other Africans from the continent and forming a Pan-African movement. 45 years later, the year I was born, the fifth Pan-African Congress took place in Manchester, and that was quite significant in that those leaders from the Caribbean, from African America, from the continent itself, were concerned about two things mainly. One, the need for Britain to cede independence to them so that they could become sovereign states and chart their own destiny. And two, that Britain should attend to what they call the color bar, the fact that although Africans as colonial subjects had given their lives in two world wars, 14 to 18 and 39 to 45, there was still systemic racism in Britain, and people who had fought to keep Nazism at arm's length and defeat it altogether were themselves facing neo-fascist conditions, and their lives were being put at risk here in Britain itself. Next one. And of course, we all know that it's 80 years since the 1944 Education Act, 50 years since the Sex Discrimination Act, the first Race Relations Act, 1976, it wasn't the first, but the first one requiring public bodies to do particular things, eliminate discrimination, promote good relations between people of different racial groups, and effectively safeguard the rights of people, Black people, eradicating anti-Blackness. That particular piece of legislation was crucial because it is only after that that employers particularly began to concern themselves with how they should safeguard the rights of their Black workers and generally not behave as if it is incidental that people are in this country, but they have a right to be here by virtue of the fact that Britain had expanded itself to where they were. Next one. Okay, this is of particular importance to me. Some of you would remember this. Ahmed Iqbal Ullah at Burnage High School in South Manchester on the 17th of September, 1986, was murdered by a classmate, Darren Colburn, in the same year group. Darren was a white working class boy. He had been harassing year 7 Bangladeshi children. Ahmed was a very tall boy and very athletic for his age. he tried to support and defend those year 7 children. Darren fought with him. Ahmed won the fight. And then Darren went home pledging that if Ahmed troubled him again, he would kill him. He armed himself with a knife the following morning, a kitchen knife, went to school. There was some provocation between the two of them, and he plunged the knife into Ahmed's stomach, and he died a couple of hours after from internal bleeding. Ian MacDonald QC was invited by Manchester City Council to conduct an inquiry into the circumstances of that murder. And he invited me, let's go to the next one, please. He invited me and these other colleagues, Reena Vavnani, a Pakistani lecturer, Lily Khan, a member of the Commission for Racial Equality, and Bangladeshi herself, and myself, to join him. And we spent many grueling weeks listening to some pretty horrendous stories about racism in that school, in other schools in Manchester, and how it came about that a culture developed within which this murder could happen. What's the point of putting that there particularly? It is because when we were doing this work, note the date, murder in 86, inquiry going on throughout 1987, something else was happening. The government was consulting on the Education Reform Act of 1988. We were quite shocked at what we were uncovering in relation to this particular racist murder. And Ian MacDonald, reputable QC, contacted that awful man, what was his name? Kenneth Baker, Secretary of State for Education, and said, look, we really must have a conversation about all of this, because if we're going to have an Education Reform Act, it is important that that act and the state indicates to schools and the whole community what the role of schooling is in reducing and confronting racism and racial violence and so on. Kenneth Baker would not meet with us. We wrote this book from the results of the inquiry. Some of you would have bought it, I'm sure. And he even refused to put the book in the House of Commons library. Now, it was the first piece of work, empirical study indeed, of how racist cultures operate and are sustained within schools, the relationship between what was going on in schools and, for example, the work of the National Front, the British National Party, Column 88, and those other neo-fascist groups. And as far as the Secretary of State for Education was concerned, that was peripheral, it was episodic, it had nothing at all to do with schooling and education in Britain as such. Next one. So again, Disability Discrimination Act of 1995, the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000, and all of that, the Sex Discrimination Act, Disability, Race, was swept up into this Single Equality Act in 2010 by David Cameron, Nick Clegg, and that coalition government. We argued, people like myself and many more, that given the lack of evidence of leaders and managers accepting responsibility for promoting those pieces of legislation, it was premature for the government to want to sweep them all up into one Single Equality Act. And we were particularly concerned that the emphasis on dealing with racism and its expansion within British society would be lost. Nobody paid any notice, and here we are now in 2025, experiencing what we did last summer, i.e. summer 2024, and everything since. I'll come back to that in a minute. Next one. Now, as an education officer in Hackney between 1989 and 1997, and indeed as an assistant education officer and head of community education in the ILEA prior to that, I needed to have some understanding of what the function of schooling, and not just schooling and education, but lifelong learning was, particularly given the history of Britain. And I found this particular quote enormously useful. The next one. Or it becomes a practice of freedom, means by which men and women deal critically, creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of the world. Paulo Freire, the late Paulo Freire, was my guru. I learned more in terms of the philosophy of education, the purpose of education, the empowerment of people through education from him than I've done from any other education theorist, practitioner, philosopher, or whatever. Next one. So how to participate in the transformation of the world? Who defines the world that we're in? Where does its assumed consensus come from? Who defines us? Who has the authority and power to define us, whoever we are and wherever we are? And whom do we actually allow to define us? Next one. So I'm saying that we are in need of repair. Britain is in need of repair because of its imperial and colonial past and how the failure to deal with the legacy of that period and of that empire remains with us in a very damaging way. As a person coming as a colonial subject, if you like, coming from the Caribbean, joining other people of the global majority in this country, I experienced being regarded as the other. We collectively were seen as the cause of Britain's problems, and Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson and all of those other dinosaurs would have us believe that today too. We, the source of all the country's ills, obstacle to community cohesion, and our ability to be at ease as a nation with ourselves. Next one. So there is an assumed homogeneity now, and there was an assumed homogeneity about Britain before the global majority started to settle here in any great numbers. It was assumed that there was no diversity before we came to swamp the nation, to use Margaret Thatcher's words. No multiculturalism before we came and imposed upon Britain our peculiar foreign and alien habits, customs, religions, and faiths. And all of that was basically cementing lies to the population as a whole. Next one. So no homogeneity amongst those racialized as white. In other words, it wasn't assumed that the dynamics of class and all of that stuff that gave rise to dispossessed working class communities, child labor, people working down pits, coal mines, tin mines, working in dark satanic mills. It wasn't imagined or conceded that those dynamics of class, of ideology, of power and oppression were very much at work within the society, causing social divisions, cementing social stratifications, and effectively leading the working class to believe that they need not have any high aspirations. Because if you're going to go down in a pit and dig coal or tin or whatever it is, you didn't need any sophisticated education. The elites went to Oxford and Cambridge and Durham and St. Andrews and so on. Those were not the places for you or your likes. And all of that has been constant throughout British history in its domestic and in its foreign policy. Next one. So for me, therefore, Britain's past is both our present and its present. We can't separate who we are now, how we're dealing with the challenges we face, badly, I would imagine, I would suggest, unless we understand the intersection of our history and British history. And yet, the country requires us to ignore its past and its moral and legal obligations that it imposes upon it. And all we're required to do is to behave ourselves, conform, don't make too many demands, don't reach above ourselves, and generally be mendicants effectively. Next one. So it is, in my view, a betrayal of many generations, particularly since the Second World War, for Britain not to have indicated what the role of schooling and education is in dealing with the legacy of empire. And that's particularly crucial, I would suggest now, because frankly, the work that Becky Francis and her team have done in that national curriculum and assessment review is nothing short of woeful. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Next one. So to stay with that theme, the nation still sees itself as being intact, homogeneous, culturally cohesive, sharing and living by fundamental British values, tolerant, fair, and against that is posited we as the othered who are causing problems for the nation by not being any of those things. Next one. These are all the tropes that we hear about the country as a whole, against which the demands that we make, not only for reparations, but for rights and entitlements, human rights, are seen to be shrill, not acceptable, and not necessary. Next one. So far as the country is concerned, especially if you listen to people like Reform and all of those people, there was nothing fractured or broken about it then, and there is nothing fractured or broken about it now, if you take us out of the equation. The country doesn't see itself as being in need of repair because of that damage done by imperialism and colonialism, and the impact that had on how Britain defines itself, how white supremacy continues to feature in practically every aspect of life in the country. Next. And the assumption here is that the country is too sophisticated to be barbaric. It assumes that there is no correspondence between the hegemony of Western epistemology, to which we are all subjected, irrespective of where we've come from, and the eugenics that informed what was done in Berlin in 1884 and 85. Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, was 60 years old when that conference was taking place. And he had a number of acolytes coming up after him. At UCL, he was a big noise. And there was a whole school of eugenics at UCL, effectively justifying why these people, those 14 white nation states, had the right to carve up Africa and ostensibly go and civilize all of those people who were considered to be not fully human because we were Black. Next one. Okay, so why do I keep on going about barbarism? I believe that it is barbaric, that this nation state has effectively has been responsible for the deaths, the manslaughter, call it what it is, of 67 elderly people from the Caribbean, many of whom came here as children, devoted all of their lives to this country, simply because the government decided that it wanted to control immigration and would get rid of them because they had not taken care to ensure that they were properly documented. Brutal, barbaric. Next one. And then we have this phenomenon. Deaths in custody. I mean, you know, the British have a very nice way of sanitizing language and not calling a spade, but an eating fork. Black people do not have a congenital tendency to die of natural causes when in contact with the police. And the fact that that is seen to be so normal that it's hardly commented upon anymore is just, to me, quite incredible. There is now a United Friends and Families campaign. I am working with the People's Tribunal on Police Killings. In September and October 2024, I was called as an expert witness in the Sheku Bayo inquiry in Edinburgh, for example. A Sierra Leone man who was killed by the police in Kirkcaldy in Fife in 2015. And all of these, if you look at all of these deaths, they've got some common elements to them. Not least of all, the excessive force used by police in controlling, restraining Black folk. And there is something quite bizarre about the manner in which coroner's inquests, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Police Federation, and all of those deal with those incidents. And you will remember some of them. Cynthia Jarrett, Roger Sylvester, Sean Rigg, too many of them to mention. And I have been working with two families now, 2015 and 2017, who are being given the runaround by the Independent Office of Police Conduct. And what that demonstrates to me is that leadership within the police service, whether it be in the Met Police Scotland or Manchester Police or whatever is absolutely dire when it comes to that phenomenon. Next one. When my friend, the same Ian MacDonald I talked about, died after an accident in Australia in 2019, I wrote a tribute for him. It's on the Garden Court, his chambers, Garden Court website. And this is what I said, talking about the rule of law that everybody, it reminds us about in this country. The rule of law is a fundamental principle at the core of every democracy. Next. But I had cause to write to Yvette Cooper. We all know who she is. A couple of months ago, because she invited me to come to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office to celebrate Black History Month. Something that David Lammy started when he was in that position a year ago. And I reminded her about this in the context of the last two slides I was talking about, but also to tell her that this is why I support and stand foursquare with Palestine Action. Bad law and the state's abuse of the law. I thank her that she hasn't sent them to arrest me. Next one. No, that's the crux of the matter. However superior and unassailable we think we might be, when we do damage to others, we also do damage to ourselves. We end up needing healing just as much as they do. And that's where my emphasis on repair and leadership of the repair process comes in. Next one. Dealing with the legacy of empire is an inescapable imperative. And this nation would never be at ease with itself until it does that. It doesn't matter whether you have Labour in power, Conservatives in power, Reform in power, Greens in power. It matters not one jot until such time that this nation embraces the responsibility for dealing with that and grows a cohort of leaders year in and year out that have got the capacity to lead that agenda. Next one. And the next. So I'm suggesting that schooling and education, lifelong learning indeed, have a role in doing these things. Dismantling notions of white supremacy, redefining whiteness, telling white people in Britain the truth about themselves, about the British past, about its present, about why its history intersects with the history of the global majority. And above all, schooling and education has a major role in humanizing the society. How could it be that in Leicester, 2 school-age children, not yet 16, could be harassing an 81-year-old Indian man, casually walking his dog, getting his exercise, troubling nobody, and being gleeful about it? What did that school do? Not just with the 2 children who were arrested for that gruesome act, but more generally, in terms of asking itself, how are we engaging our children on this issue of race and racism, anti-Blackness, and the rest of it? How are we ensuring that all of those who took to the streets with these neo-fascists after the Southport murders, and by all of those, I mean all of those young children, some of them not yet in their teens, how are we assisting them in understanding those events, understanding what all of that flag waving business means, because it has nothing to do with patriotism. And if you have a curriculum and assessment review happening at precisely this time, and there is no mention of any of that whatsoever in the document, they talk about diversity and wishy-washy nebulous concepts like community cohesion. There's nothing about race, nothing about anti-Blackness, nothing about how Black children are being harassed in school day by day. I studied theology in Oxford in the middle 1960s. I was en route to becoming a Roman Catholic priest until sense caught up with me. And while I was there, I was working with the children of Caribbean car workers in East Oxford, Cowley, Blackbird Leys, at the Austin and Morris car factory. And we had to be confronting the racism of white children, the lack of understanding of white teachers, the number of children who are being shunted into schools for the educationally subnormal because of the way that they spoke, because of their lack of understanding and acculturation to British ways of living and so on and so forth. Roll on, God knows what, 60 years. My granddaughter is at a school in Cardiff in year 6. And a young white boy in her class gets up and announces to the class, let's call her Anna. Announces to the class, from now on, let's call Anna nigger. What does the teacher do? The teacher gets up and says, stop being so silly. End of story. End of story. Well, it wasn't really the end of the story because I was living in Cardiff at the time. And I went into the school and the head teacher had to go home and tie a towel around his head for 3 damn days. So, 1966, I started the first Black supplementary school in Oxford. 2024, I'm dealing with this nonsense in a school in Cardiff. And it's happening all around England, even now. After the 2000 Race Relations Amendment Act, there was a requirement, some of you will remember, that schools record the number of racist incidents that were happening weekly or monthly or whatever in the schools. Cameron and that lot came in and decided that that was red tape. And they had to get rid of all of this red tape. In other words, it doesn't really matter what's happening to these Black children or to Black teachers who are being harassed by white students or whatever else it may be. It's red tape. Let's get rid of all of that. Let's shrink government. You get rid of that. You get rid of the need for race equality impact assessments. Ofsted is told, do light touch inspections. So although you put the Race Relations Act in place in order to ensure and guarantee people's rights, you basically say, well, don't even bother with all of that. Let people get on with the business. Embracing your neoliberal agenda, removing the right of local elected officers and people, elected members, to manage the schooling provision and letting it be a free market, a free for all. So people's rights go out of the window. You determine what should and should not be measured and accounted for. And then we begin to wonder why there is so much unrest and lack of social cohesion and so on in the place. Next one. And why does all of this matter? It matters for this reason. Better equip its young people of every ethnicity with the values, the knowledge, the understanding, the skills, the aptitudes that would enable them to build a future nation that has the hallmark of equity, justice, and respect for human rights. This is not a language that Keir Starmer understands, never mind that awful fellow, Nigel Farage. And I find it troubling. As somebody who's given 60 years of my life dealing with this stuff, I find it all deeply, deeply troubling. Next one. And it's troubling for this reason. Next one. So that's my take on the matter. I'm coming to an end. You'd be pleased to hear. That's my take on the matter. Confronting structural, cultural, institutional, and personal forms of discrimination and exclusion. And why structural? Structural and systemic racism and discrimination perpetuated by people in government leading to misery on the axis of race, ethnicity, class, etc., for swathes of the population. Next one. And so that, in terms of your agenda and leadership, that is what I think it means. It's a process that needs to be led, but judging from the last 60 years, I, for one, feel able to ask the question, where do leaders come from? How are they equipped with leadership skills? Who defines what those leadership skills should be? Next. And what is their understanding of the context in which they are leading and how that context makes for different ways of seeing the world and of being in the world? I bet you, my friends, if we were to bring 150 head teachers or executive directors or whatever these grand people call themselves of academies and multiple academy trusts in one room and pose this question, I think we would be alarmed at the answers and the lack of answers to precisely that. That is why I believe leadership of this agenda on the part of prime ministers, secretaries of state, head teachers, university vice chancellors, leadership on this issue is woeful. Next. And they have been, as I've been saying, betraying generations in the schooling and education system since 1944. Next one. So these are the challenges that we face. I think you would agree. Globalization, climate change, the movement of populations on account of climate change, And it doesn't matter whether we put massive, great boundaries around ourselves, that too is not sustainable. Within the next 2 decades, we come to a point where, as a result of climate change and globalization, we have to totally reconsider our attitudes towards borders and who is legal and who is illegal, who has a right to choose to stay alive rather than being in some desert, being shriveled up by the sun and dying. Next one. Fundamental questions. Next one. There's a tension between those two things, a permanent tension. Leading with moral purpose on the one hand, and leading as coercive compliance on the other hand. You do XYZ because the government wants you to hand in some returns to show what's happening here or there. Or you do XYZ because you know Ofsted would be coming and these are the criteria on which they're going to judge your performance. So all of that stuff that I was talking about, which requires some commitment to moral purpose, goes out of the window, especially in the context of market economies and neoliberalism and the rest of it. Next one. I will end with this. Another quotation from my guru. Education does not change society. Education changes people. People change society. And if we are about the business of the leadership of change, we each have a responsibility to understand for ourselves what this means and understand why it is crucial that we do not simply subscribe to this neoliberal notion, but understand that throughout history, people have had to engage in collective action in order to bring about change and to resist tyranny, to resist oppression, to affirm their humanity. So again, I would assert that the purpose of schooling and education is to humanize society. It is not, certainly not, to recycle elitism and sow social divisions. And that is why your interest in, your commitment to building quality leadership is so crucial to our business, our operations, at particularly at this point in time. I've gone on for a while. I'm sorry about that, but I hope that this message resonates with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor John. It indeed does resonate. Thank you so very much. We appreciate your powerful talk and how it's linked history, leadership, and the practice of freedom, and connecting those to the pathway to repair and humanizing society. So, to everyone, we've got just a few minutes to take questions and comments. We probably can take only two questions or one question and one comment. So if you have those ready, you can just unmute yourself and make it really brief, please, and so that Professor John can answer that. Or if you would alternatively like to type it in chat, please do so, so that we can move on to the next item on the agenda. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question or comment, possible. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Oh yeah, hi. My name's
Please
Dominique.
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm just putting the light. I'm sat in my car. Just sorry. Yeah, I am. Well, everything that you said, just was completely rang true for me. Every single thing that you said. So, I've been a senior leader in education. I'm based in Bristol. I've been an advocate for anti-racism work in schools for a really long time. Trying to do that work in my own school, which I've been successful with. But now I actually do that work around the country. But what I'm finding, and it's particularly in my region, I've had a lot of meetings with senior leaders, head teachers actually, and council leaders in the region, and the feeling is moving in a different direction. The responses I'm getting are, but why are we always talking about race? You know, there are other pressing issues. You know, the white working class are the most disaffected and disengaged, and therefore we need to do something about that. And obviously, because I'm in Bristol, the work is more important here than anywhere, I would argue, because of what the challenges we've got, the history of slavery and colonialism. And yet I feel very frustrated that that I don't get that understanding from head teachers and even council leaders, who will give me an audience, but beyond that will not commit to doing this work in their schools. So I just wondered if you had any advice about how I could try and get them to understand how important this work is. There was a huge movement after the murder of George Floyd, it was a commitment, but now it's just, you know, the momentum's gone. Nobody seems that bothered. So
Thank you, Dominique.
Yes.
So can we take the second question or comment right away, and then Professor John just gives the answer to both or responds to both at the same time.
Yinka, there's one in the chat, and Lorna has her hand up.
Thanks.
I'll read the one in the chat for you.
Yes, please.
Deborah is saying 16-year-olds will be able to vote at the next election. How do we address this when these subjects are not discussed in schools?
Sure. Shall we
I
take
think
Lorna
Lorna
as
has
well?
one.
Hello, Professor
Yes.
Gus John. Lovely to see you again.
Hi.
And fellow members of the BELMAS and everybody else. Fantastic presentation. I am a lecturer at UCL, and just recently we had a conference of leaders talking about the whole notion of transformative leadership. And this is now I call it the name of the day for leadership, being a transformative leader. Now, one of the notions was about personal reflection as a leader, and leading as learning and being in learning. Yes. But for me, and one of the things I want to ask Professor Gus John is, there's this notion of diversifying assumptions, or looking at different assumptions and having a diverse set of people coming together in terms of allyship and relationship building. But there's no notion of, they talk about knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. How do we, bring the notion of anti-blackness, and the notion of understanding the past, Sankofa, learning from the past to go forward, into the space of transformative leader? And you talked about it a little bit in terms of what is quality leadership. How do we embody this so-called and actually lead on what a true leader should be in schools in a diverse world? That's me.
Okay. We could stay with these at least these three issues for another half hour. I know we don't have half an hour. I'll try and be brief. First of all, my colleague from Bristol, I empathize with your position. I mentor teachers and school leaders when I have the energy, and that comes up quite regularly. I think when I talk about national leadership and national leaders having as much of a responsibility as leaders in institutions, this is what I think I'm talking about. People are overstretched. There are many demands made on particular leaders, especially within the sort of school improvement agenda, for example, or in relation to universities, about making sure that people are employable when they come out with their degrees and so on and so forth. But my view is that if you exclude the societal concerns that I'm talking about, what is the societal relation? What is the societal responsibility of a school or a college or a university in the context of the lives that people are living, the environment in workplaces that your graduates or your students would go to, the leadership they themselves are expected to demonstrate amongst their peers as they live their values, as they make decisions about what is right and what is wrong for them to do, how others should be treated, etc. If you ignore all of that stuff, you become like some kind of a conveyor belt conveying carrots to put into boxes to sell at Waitrose or Sainsbury's or something. Which is why the business about education changing people and people changing society is crucial in that respect. So therefore, how does the school set its agenda? What is its agenda? How does it begin to relate, for example, to a local curriculum where individuals have some understanding of how they come to be where they are, how others who are not like them come to be there? What is the relationship between them and labor? What is the relationship between them and the labor market? What is the relationship between them and issues of development, underdevelopment, etc.? It seems to me that one must be able to address those kinds of questions in an organic way. So when I talk about the hegemony of Western epistemology, what I'm saying is that there are all kinds of modes of knowledge production which are erased, considered invalid, whereas they are precisely the forms of engagement with understanding the world and one another and interacting cohesively, etc., which are necessary for children, for teachers themselves, and indeed more widely within the society. So basically what I think I'm saying is, never mind transformative leadership, the whole thing needs a reset. And the reset has got to come from what are the expectations the government has of schools and what expectations the schools believe students should have of them. And in relation to the business of children voting at 16 and so forth, it would be interesting to see how that pans out for the very reasons that you gave. I have said and been unpopular for it for God knows how long, including amongst my teachers, my head teachers in Hackney. If you're going to engage children in democratic participation, you should begin by democratizing schooling. And ask yourself the question, what does democratizing schooling mean in terms of children, the power they were able to exert in determining the curriculum, in determining ways of interacting with one another, in determining school codes of discipline and all of those sorts of things. And it ought to be an arena within which one can deal with all of that without losing any of the objectives, the learning objectives one wants to see children achieve in the schooling career. So what I'm saying is that the whole system has been made too rigid. Some of you will remember that in 1974, Alan Bullock, the Bullock Report, talked about the importance of talk in relation to children and their development and teachers' understanding of how they learn and so on. It's an education philosophy that's in many ways been long forgotten. Children are not encouraged to have those debates. And some of them are going to be very difficult debates, given the difficult arenas that children occupy, whether it be on social media or in the communities or whatever else. But you can't have all of that going on and have schools programmed in a very rigid fashion to do the kind of things that this curriculum review is suggesting, without understanding that for many children, that remains irrelevant, and the schooling career adds up to very little more than what I call the destruction of hope and the death of aspiration.
Yeah, I don't really feel it's my place to come in here, but I can't agree with that more, Gus. I mean, what we've done is we've made everything so much more authoritarian and authoritative. We've driven everything further and further away from democracy. And just as TikTok has got all that power over all those 15, 16-year-olds, including my own 15-year-old, we're now going to let them vote. And I gave evidence in the Crick report back in 1998 in Parliament about why 16-year-olds shouldn't be given the vote, because our political education wasn't good enough. And I think, I probably disagree with that now. I think 16-year-olds probably should be given the vote, but only if we can put in place a decent democratic education system so they understand what they're contributing to and why. Because otherwise, you've already said it as part of your discourse tonight, otherwise we fast track a reform government, don't we? That's it's clearly one of the outcomes.
Indeed, I couldn't agree with that more there. And it seems to me that the one thing I think is really lacking increasingly amongst young people. Okay, I can't generalize because there are particular groups forming themselves around the place to deal with precisely that. But generally speaking, the extent to which schooling engages in or enables children to acquire political literacy is absolutely ridiculous. It does not happen. And in terms of using the vote, political literacy becomes so very important. Just basic understanding of fundamental things, not just the business of who you vote for and how you cast your ballot, etc. There is much more to do with how communities cohere, how they ensure that they address common interests, rather than seeing the interests of some as being, or demands of some as being antithetical to that of others. And understand that whole process of othering, which goes on amongst themselves too, of course, as young people. So you're absolutely right, and I think that's why I'm suggesting there needs to be a reset of what all of that is about. We need to go back to 1944 or to a 1944 type agenda and redefine in the wake of current global trends what the role of schooling and education should be in a nation such as this.
And that poses the big question, who leads that? If you haven't got this government leading on that, with this opportunity that Becky Francis was given, who leads it? Where do we look to for the political and the educational leadership for that? Because at the moment we're lacking on every front.
Yes. Yes. But having said that, we have hope, and we have hope because we have one another. Yes. And by that I mean people who are committed to building a different society, committed to making what I call the future we face, the future we actually want, and understanding that it's like building blocks. So we work with a group of colleagues around particular issues, around particular agendas. We engage with people's lives and make a difference in young people's lives and that of their parents in small ways, thereby empowering them to understand the power that they have to bring about change as individuals, and what they can do to make life much more bearable, livable for them and for others around them. Is that disempowering that I find particularly gruesome, and the idea that your only purpose is really to commit to one particular political agenda, vote for some particular individuals, and give them authority to go and do just what they damn well like once you voted for them, you know. And that's what I hear you meaning by saying that, you know, we need to reshape what we mean by a democratic order in that sense.
Yes, that's absolutely it. That's absolutely it. And it's about how that reshaping happens and who is leading on that reshaping, given that the people that we thought might are not seeming to respond in the way that we perhaps hoped they would. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Claire, you had your hand up, and okay. I know Yinka's supposed to be chairing this session. What we were just agreeing was that if people wanted to keep going, you were perhaps okay to delay your agenda for sort of 5 or 10 minutes, just because it was a very valuable conversation to be having.
Sorry, Deb, I'm just going to go back to Yinka, who's chairing this bit.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Deb. Indeed, it's quite a spirited conversation, so we are able to take a few more questions or comments, and I think I'll go first. So, Professor John, I just thought, you know, I keep thinking and I keep going back to the thoughts that the education of educators is quite important in terms of you've asked the questions, who chooses who's a leader, who determines where we're headed, because higher education itself has been emblematic of white supremacy and one of its greatest enforcers and distributors. And how do we tackle this?
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask a question, if that's all right, Professor John. I was thinking about what Deb would say.
Sure, Claire.
I was just thinking about, I've been a head teacher. I was a head teacher in Bristol, and I'm really mindful of the way that we construct head teachers as being led by someone, or giving away power to the Department for Education and constructing people as being ordered by. And yes, those policies do order society, they do order the way that we do things, but there is also, in my experience, head teachers are very close to and loving of the communities in which they work. And there has been a very determined attempt to decontextualize schools from their communities through multi-academy trust, through, you know, Harris,
Sure.
exactly the same carpets, exactly
Yes.
the same curtains, monoliths of the same curriculum, the same books, which anybody who's run a school will know is highly problematic and might be a good way to evaluate outcomes, but actually is no way to run a school. So what gives me hope is the fact that there are head teachers who are subverting. There have always been teachers who vocational practitioners, I would describe them as, who are leading practice and leading children and leading families who are not in line, not in alignment, and have never been in alignment with any of the whiteness of these policies. And that I think we have to be really mindful of not hoping that or not constructing that leadership as coming from the DFE, because it won't. I really think it won't. I think that is a futile idea. But actually, how do we engage and ignite reignite the passions of head teachers who are doing work every single day to support and work against some of these policies that they've been given?
No, I agree with you totally. One of the best experiences I had when running a small charity, 3 people and myself started a charity in 1999 called the Communities Empowerment Network. And it is dedicated principally to giving support to children who are excluded from school and their families. Some little while ago, we had a very close working relationship with a former children's commissioner, Dr. Maggie Atkinson. And Maggie commissioned some work on school exclusion, and particularly looking at the increasing rate at which children with special educational needs were being excluded. And presented some reports to the government and challenged them on, for example, the expectations they had of teachers in relation to certain behaviors of children, etc. And I was really pleased to see that many teachers were kicking back against what the DFE, etc., wanted them to do in this regard, starting from a position of every child matters, but particularly every child's needs is different from that of other children. And consequently, you've got to do a balancing act in relation to making sure that the provisions are in place so that each child gets their educational entitlement. Now, that's not the kind of language that Ofsted seems to understand, especially when it's doing these full-scale inspections and so on and so forth. So I agree with you. One of the things that I find disappointing, however, is that in relation to, for example, issues such as police in schools and school exclusions, there has not been more, more resistance on the part of head teacher bodies to those things, because it seems to me that the issue of having to manage children and their behaviors in schools is one thing, but to suggest that one size fits all just doesn't seem to make any sense, especially given the social divisions we have within communities and the challenges children face in their own homes, never mind in the larger community. So those things are quite complex. And the more teachers and head teachers as leaders claim some space to be able to operate, if you like, more or less semi-independently of those challenges and demands, the more I think we would have a more equitable experience in terms of what schooling does for particularly dispossessed communities.
Thank you, Professor John. There's a remark, there's a comment in the chat, and that probably will be the last one we'll take. And it's centering on how people would claim to be anti-racist, but ignore the current genocide uh, in other parts of the world, and how we need to name the centuries of colonial genocide for what it was and continues to be. So I think it's linking to racist regimes globally and Palestine in particular. So if you have any remarks about that.
Yes, I mean, I agree. I agree entirely. What we've seen in the last period has been a lot of what I call moral relativism and selective morality on a number of issues. The Israeli-Palestine one is a particularly gruesome one. And I mean, I won't go into that in any great detail. We don't have the time. But what I think is quite wrong is for there to be, if you like, a Zionist agenda that's imposed upon everybody, including by people like Keir Starmer, who, although he announced the commission that Becky Francis was going to be leading, before she even produced her interim report, he was announcing at the Holocaust Remembrance Day last year, or was it earlier this year, that he's going to make teaching the Holocaust compulsory in every school, irrespective of its particular character. Now, okay, you may say that there is nothing particularly wrong with that. My view, however, is this, that you can't on the one hand say you're not trying to erect a hierarchy of oppression and then suggest that all children, including the refugees from Gaza, resident in England and going to English schools, that you should teach everybody the Holocaust, when you are actually similarly suggesting that the IHRA definition of Zionism requires you not to criticize the state of Israel for what it is doing in Palestine. It doesn't make any sense. Leaving aside the fact, of course, that he's had the report of Martin Ford sitting on his desk for the last 3 years on racism and has done absolutely nothing about it. More recently, he's announced that all nurses are going to be given anti-Semitic training. And yet we're having reports, even this week, of the suffering of Black nurses from racist patients and other members of staff. So the whole thing, it makes people very cynical. And it suggests that those who shout the loudest get to be heard by leaders of state, whether it be Trump or Biden or hopeless Starmer.
Thank you very much, Professor John, and thank you everyone for your questions and for your comments. We'll need to move quickly along now, and over to Steve, our convener.
Thank you very much, Professor John, for such a lovely, riveting discussion from your presentation all the way through Q&A up until this point. I was glued. I was making notes in my little book. I was looking up things as you were talking. And it's such a wonderful way to start off our year as the Race and Leadership Research Interest Group of BELMAS. And so it falls to me to talk about what it is that we're going to be doing to build on the momentum that we've gained here today. So one of the things we want to talk about is the fact that the theme that you've spoken today,
Yeah, go on. Sorry, go.
Oh, one of the things that we want to talk about is the theme for our event here today is also the theme for our year as the Race and Leadership Rig. We want to be having these kinds of critical and crucial examinations of what the global imperatives for race and leadership are, especially in this moment that we have found ourselves when we look at the genocides happening across the globe and the anti-Black racism,
Right.
the atrocities being perpetrated against people of the global majority. And so this is going to be our guiding phrase or guiding theme or guiding philosophy, if you will, for the year. But then if we're going to talk about it, we have to figure out how are we going to sort of make it more accessible. And how we've decided on that as the conveners of this rig, and we're open to the feedback from the other persons who are here today, is to look at it under three sub themes. And it's so wonderful that the alignment happened in this way, because without even directly knowing the discussions that the four of us have had as conveners, you spoke to all three of these sub themes. So there's the sub theme of disruptive leadership. There's also the moving away from the colonial, and the colonial can mean several different things. We won't impose a definition because imposing that definition would in fact be colonial. And then we want to also look at knowledge creation and dissemination beyond the mainstream. So we understand and we appreciate that there are ways that knowledge is created and knowledge is disseminated, but that also does not effectively serve people who are racialized as members of the global majority. So we want to look at how can we as a research interest group sort of chip away at that. Now, there are very specific ways that we're going to be doing that. Claire, can we go to the next one, please? And so the ways that we right now are thinking of giving this race and leadership rig something to look forward to. And again, we are open to suggestions from the people inside the room as well as the others who will join us. We have three main touch points. The first is going to be our race and leadership rig reading group. The second, and all of these feedback into the larger BELMAS narrative. And I think if we have the time to allow Deb to talk about it or Cynthia to talk about it, you'll see just exactly how it fits into the bigger picture. So we're going to have the race and leadership reading group. Then there's the BELMAS blog, and then there are journal contributions that can happen and that will be facilitated through the larger BELMAS framework. Now, to talk about each of these three things in a little bit more specificity, I want to start with the reading group. So we're planning on having 3 of those meetings per year. And how it will work is that we will send out the reading at least, I think, 6 weeks ahead of the meeting date so that people can have a chance to engage with it. They're going to be short articles about, again, the theme and the sub-themes that we're engaging with for the year. So we shared the article that we're intending to engage around, and people can read as well as facilitate other sorts of reading of other material that speak to the same issues. And then we meet on the day to have a discussion. So the day we're thinking of right now is the 27th of January, 2025. 5 to 6 p.m. GMT. So I'm aware that we have people who are from different time zones. I'm in a different time zone right now. I think we had somebody from, was it Saudi Arabia? I don't remember. I heard it in the beginning, but I can't remember. So the timing that we share is Dubai. Thank you so much, Prof. John. The timing for that is UK time. And the first reading is this one, Sankofa, Towards African-Centered Research Methodological Framework. And it speaks to, again, the themes of stepping away from the colonial, as well as deviating from mainstream forms of knowledge creation and dissemination. It is open access, and you can access it using the QR code on screen. So I'm going to let that linger for a little bit, just in case people want to take their phones and do the QR code. And I believe we can send this out to persons who've joined here today, because we do have that mailing list. So even if you don't get a chance to do your QR code right now, you will have access to these slides. All right, here we can go over to the second one. The second one is the BELMAS blog. Now this functions in the larger framework of BELMAS. If you scan that QR code, it takes you to the site that tells you what the blog is about and how you can contribute to it. But just to give the broad strokes of it, The blog facilitates 800-word submissions, and they can be about any other things there is. So whether it's an opinion piece, whether you want to write about what you've discussed in reading group, if somebody wants to take on the challenge of writing up a piece about what we've discussed here today, basically anything that fits within the frame of what BELMAS does. And not only this race and leadership rig, but the other rigs as well feed into that because they have their mandates. So there is that. You would email your submission to blog@belmas.org.uk. And this QR code, like I said, takes you to the section of the website where you will have access to that. The third and penultimate touch point is that BELMAS has 2 journals, and those are the Education Management, Administration, and Leadership Journal and the Management and Education Journals. If you take a scan of this QR code, it takes you to the page that will show you what the scope of those journals are, what kind of articles they facilitate, how you submit to each of those journals, and what the editorial process is like. But beyond these 2 journals that are housed at BELMAS, your BELMAS membership, which I'm going to come to in a little bit, gives you access to 4 additional journals, and that information, again, is all on the site. So even if you opt not to submit into these journals, there are those 4 other journals that you can submit into. And then the final thing that's not there, I'm about to pop it into the chat, is that we want persons, if you have not yet joined BELMAS, to become a member of BELMAS, because that is now how you get the full experience of what BELMAS has to offer. So if you click that link that I just popped in the chat, it takes you to the application form. You pop your details in, you pay your membership fees, and you have full access to the entire range of possibilities that BELMAS has to offer. And with that, I am going to throw back to Claire, who started us off. I think you wanted to hand over to Deb for a little bit. We do have a little bit more time on the phone.
Yeah, I was just conscious that Stephen has another meeting, so I really think that's a really important piece. Again, my thanks go to Professor Gus John, but we had a really important part at the beginning with Deb, because we wanted to pay homage and tribute to the people who've made all of this possible. So this group, this piece, this meeting, this community has been nurtured and cared for and looked after by 2 giants in educational leadership. So Deb's going to just pay tribute to Professor Paul Miller and Professor Christine Callender just before we close.
Thanks, Claire, that's great. And I'm sorry I wasn't here right at the start, everybody, because that had been my intention. But just to echo a huge thanks to Gus today, because that was a really, as Toby put in his comment, is a really great tour de force, just to put all of those things right back centrally on everybody's radar. Gus, thank you. I just wanted really to make sure that everybody who was here today really understood the work, and Fraser's also with us today, that colleagues in BELMAS have done across the decades alongside people like Gus to really keep this as a central theme. And both Paul Miller and Christine Callender were in this rig as co-conveners for a long while. And for a long while after that, it then just didn't kind of go anywhere. And we all understand that people have their different research interests at different times. But for me, not least because of the conversation we've been having this evening, you can see why there is a need for a community like BELMAS. And it's great, Philip, that you've joined us over from the States. Terrific. It's so important that we have a space where we can reach out with the focus of race and educational leadership, and where you can see through that talk that Stephen's just done with you, the areas where we can connect for the research in that, okay? We have charitable incorporated status, but we only have that if we're meeting our charitable aims and expectations. We are a social justice leadership organisation. If we're not doing stuff in this area, we're not very much of a social justice leadership organisation, are we? So for me, this was one of the big things I wanted to make sure we moved on and carried that legacy forward, because I think really we need it now. I'm not going to say more than ever before. I grew up in the 80s. I remember those battles. but we need it as much as previous times that we have lived through. And it is important that we are doing it and actively seen to be doing it. So I just wanted to make sure that Paul and Christine were mentioned really as part of that conversation, but also we have that door wide open now for other scholars coming in, researching the field, and we give an active place and space in our journals, on our BELMAS blog, in our LinkedIn postings. I know, Gus, you're sticking with X. A lot of us can't bear the idea of sticking with X, but I understand why you are. I get it, right? So just to have this as a space, I think is tremendously important. So I'm sorry I didn't start with that, everybody, and I'm sorry I was here late, but it was really terrific to be here with you this evening. And I'm hoping that with those other venues and areas that Stephen's outlined, you go on to be a really, really successful research interest group. I think the idea of a reading group is so important, actually. I think that is really terrific. I think you might find other research interest groups follow you in that. It's not a format I've seen any of the other rigs do, but I think it's really important.
I think what's just so exciting about this is there feels like there's lots of energy in the room, and Professor John has just brought even more in. Thank you so much. I'm aware of time. We are so grateful to you, Deb, for speaking and for putting us in touch with Professor John. Professor John, it has been, I don't think you'll have any idea what it's done for our feeling about what we've talked about in little Zoom rooms together. And now it feels like you've just given life and energy and power to this rig to be able to create something really magical. And I'm sure Viv and Yinka and Stephen will concur as well. So thank you so much. Really, thank you so much for being here. And if you
delighted.
And we're so grateful to you. We really are. Thank you, Deb, for making the time. I know that it hasn't been as planned, but we got there. We got there. So it just leaves me to say, if you like what we're talking about, if you're interested in what we're talking about, please come with us. Tell people about what we're doing. We are all former school leaders, policy practitioners, and we have race researchers. We're interested in making change. We're not here to dally. We're here to make something happen. So if you want to make something happen too, please join our rig and come with us, because we will co-create together. So I want to end by thanking Professor John again, Viv Grant, Stephen Francis, and Yinka Oganusi, and I want to say a particular thank you to Cynthia, who is behind the scenes just supporting us and championing us. So colleagues, I will close there. Thank you so much for being here.